The Witcher, Season 2. This is one of those reviews for which I will require a drink to kind of get through, which is, of course, terrible news and kind of points to where this is all going to go. The first season of the show debuted on Netflix 2 years ago, and I thought it was alright. There were things I didn't like about it, but for the most part I felt it kept true to the spirit of the books, which I am a massive fan of. In fact, in terms of fantasy series, I think this is my favorite one of all time. I've read and reread them multiple times, I'm a fan of the books and so on. And I remember thinking after the show, if they just listen to the criticisms from the fans and correct some of the mistakes, it's going to be much better next season, and the show has a bright future ahead of it. I was wrong. On the one hand, the showmakers definitely did improve some things. The production design is much better, by which I mean the costumes, the hair, the makeup, the locations. The CGI is even better than it was, particularly including the monsters, which for the most part look really terrific. Geralt is more talkative, which I thought was missing from the first season, and this is actually apparently something that Henry Cavill himself pushed for as fan of the books as well. And this time around the narrative also drops the 3 different timeline thing, which I found interesting personally, but I know was confusing to a lot of people, so now it's all simple and linear. So on some fronts, on the surface level, there is actually improvement. However, everything beneath that surface is an affront to the source material. It seems to me like nobody involved with the production is actually bothered to read the books, because the show doesn't just change the plot, it essentially just drops it all together and actively invents a new, different one. Now, listen, I understand when you're adapting books to the screen, there need to be changes in order to fit the new medium. I mean, hell, even Lord of the Rings changed a lot of things and is considered one of the best adaptations of all time, rightfully so. On the other hand, just this year we've had Dune, which was a massive success in every respect, and it was actually a very faithful adaptation, lifting some scenes straight out from the books. So, you know, you can be very faithful and still be successful. But anyway, I'm sort of accepting the premise that you need to change some things. But while I'm fine with cutting scenes and characters, changing the details of the plot, merging some storylines, or adding new dialogue, I'm definitely not fine when the adaptation goes against the entire spirit of the original, just changing the core of the story. This season is mostly adapting book 1 of the Witcher saga, which is Blood of the Elves, and that particular book is pretty slow. It has little action, focusing mostly on the development of characters as individuals, mostly Ciri, and in relation to one another, Ciri, Geralt, and Yennefer. It also does a lot, really a lot of world building and setup for future political intrigue. Now, weirdly enough, the show seems to be doing similar things, but if you actually think about it, it does them all wrong. First of all, instead of letting the story breathe, it invents numerous plot lines to fill the time, plot lines that didn't exist in the books. The demon forest witch thing, that's essentially the main storyline of this season, that's made up, that didn't exist in the books. Yennefer losing her magic, that's made up, that didn't exist in the books. Elves not being able to conceive babies, that's made up, that didn't exist. Magic obelisks, which Ciri destroys for some reason, that's also made up, that didn't exist in the books. A significant part of the show is just nowhere to be found in the source material. There are several problems which that brings though, which is that a lot of these subplots don't exist in a vacuum. They directly influence the characters' motivations, their dynamics, and the whole political intrigue that's slowly building up as well. And with changes this significant, this early on in the saga, I just have no clue how they plan to go forward with the story as it was written. Because, you know, a lot of the events later on in the later books require specific setup now. And if that setup is not only not there, it's not just missing, it's just completely different, then it's not going to actually be a book adaptation very soon, is it? I mean, if you veer so far off the tracks, then you have no way of returning to them at some point. Also, one of the invented subplots has a lot to do with Yennefer, sending her on this long, elaborate side quest for a couple of the initial episodes, and I couldn't help but feel that the showrunners doing this subplot, they are essentially trying to work out a solution to the problem that they themselves invented. Because you see, they spent the entire first season establishing, building up Geralt, Ciri, and Yennefer as three main characters, like equals in terms of the screen time. And going into season 2, you get the feeling that they really wanted to maintain that balance. Problem is, in the books, Yennefer, while still being an extremely important character, is definitely not on the same level of, let's say, screen time as Geralt and Ciri. She isn't in the center of the events all the time. There are large portions of the story where we don't know what she's up to. We don't know where she is. And that doesn't mean she's not significant or that she's not doing anything. She is there. She's just sort of operating off screen, unknown to the reader. And the show tries to invent things for her to do which it can show. And it fails miserably at making it compelling. Also in the process, destroying her entire... destroying her character from the books, that's one thing. But it even destroys her character development from season 1 of the show. She spent all of her backstory previously going from this ugly, poor, powerless girl to a powerful mage, right? Who takes charge, takes care of her own destiny and can suddenly, control other people and control her own future. And now in episode 1, she no longer can cast spells, which is like the most important thing for her. What is that? Who thought of that thing? I mean, it just moves her back to square one, and even worse, her character is essentially rolled back. She doesn't really have clear motivations. It just flip-flops back and forth between different goals as the season goes on. Speaking of characters, I think that Yennefer is not the only one, sadly, who is a shadow of her book self. Dijkstra is much less interesting. Cahir is changed from this young, naive, manipulated zealot that then grows into this heroic guy, into just a conniving, scheming commander. But what was done to the Witchers at Kaer Morhen, it's just straight up criminal, It's character assassination, that's what it's called. Particularly Eskel, who in the books was Geralt's perhaps closest Witcher friend, being from the same generation, from the same batch of Witchers. And he was just a general bro. He was always willing to help out, and then his entire character was that he had this massive scar, and Ciri was initially very afraid of him, but he was like the most gentle out of all of those Witchers. He was very polite, he was very well spoken. In here, he's a drunkard, partying, asshole fuckboy who is very quickly removed from the story altogether. But believe it or not, even worse is Vesemir. When he's first introduced, I thought, well, at least he looks like he should, in the books, in the games. He'll probably be pretty good. It's difficult to ruin that simple of a character. But the longer he's on screen, the worse he becomes, standing in complete opposition to what the character is in the books. He's sort of indecisive. He lets fear get the best of him, but his entire motivations, his actions, his relationship to Ciri, it's just so different. It's completely opposite than what he should be, than what he represented, than what role he fulfilled in those books. And in general, the whole point of the Kaer Morhen storyline in the books, I think Eskel's character encapsulated it pretty well, because apart from Ciri's development, the point of the Kaer Morhen storyline was to show that all of those Witchers are essentially, ugly, dangerous killers on the outside, but they're actually kind, caring, good people on the inside, and they immediately took Ciri's side and took her in and took care of her. In the show, there is not a trace of that, and it's heartbreaking. Also, when we're talking about characters, 2 points to make. One about the dialogue, one about the acting. The dialogue, and in fact the whole direction of the show, is so gloomy, so full of ridiculous pathos and seriousness. All of the characters are dreary all the time, and they have these really stiff lines. Listen, I get that it's a story about destiny and magic and saving the world, yada yada, but it can't be all about that. There need to be moments of levity where characters are allowed to be people, speaking about normal things, not just these grand, serious concepts. The most egregious example was when Yennefer runs out of a sewer in episode 4, I think, escaping from a monster, and she just starts going into this rambling, shouting monologue about losing power. It's really, really embarrassing, especially as Sapkowski's strongest suit in the books was always dialogue. He was able to write in ways that were witty and fun, and yes, they were insightful and thought-provoking at times, but there was always a balance between pathos and bluntness, between epic seriousness and being refreshingly direct. The only traces of that here are people occasionally saying fuck, and the whole character of Jaskier, who is totally like the polar opposite of everyone else in terms of the tone. Nobody else in the show smiles or makes jokes or speaks like a human being. And on the other hand, all Jaskier is able to do is crack jokes, throw quips, never being serious at all. It's it's a very jarring contrast. And it shows that the writers have no idea how to actually flesh out real characters. And about the performances, the point I wanted to make. I'm very sorry to say this, but I did not buy a single performance this season. I'm sure that the actors are trying their best, but it just seemed like the direction was always, this is a sad line, be sad when saying it. Or this is an angry moment, so shout this line very loudly. Like, there is no nuance, there is no depth of emotion. You only ever get the surface level. I'll put it like this. What I appreciate most about acting performances is whenever I see an actor who has a certain emotion on the surface in the scene, but you can see in their eyes, in their voice, in their subtle facial expressions that there is more underneath, that they are not necessarily thinking or even feeling the same thing they are saying out loud, because this is how real humans are. And there is exactly zero instances of that happening in The Witcher. What you see is the only thing that's there. I never believed that the characters are actually feeling or thinking about anything that they're saying. It was just stiff lines after stiff lines. One final point, the logistics. Jesus Christ. The amount of time the characters teleport across the world is staggering. And I don't mean literal teleports, because there are those as well, and those are fine, you know, this works within the context of the story. But there are multiple times where characters travel by horseback, or worse, on foot, from one country to another, in what seems like minutes or hours. The world of The Witcher is supposed to be huge, but you never feel that, because traveling doesn't exist here. Everyone is just magically appearing wherever they need to be at any given moment. The most horrible example of that is the end of episode 7 into the beginning of episode 8. Episode 7 ends with the main cast being within sight of Sintra, the city, where they all just magically appeared from several different places at once, by the way. And the beginning of episode 8 sees them back in Kaer Morhen, which is supposed to be weeks of travel away, exactly on the other side of the continent. And judging by the dialogue and the events and the behavior of the characters, only a couple hours passed at most. I mean, what the fuck is this? It makes you feel like the whole world of the show is just a single neighborhood. It feels small and inconsequential, where it was a significant part of the books as well. There are multiple stretches of the story where the characters are just trying to get from one point to another, and it takes weeks. So to bring this all to a close somehow, I really am very sorry to have to say all of this, but because I am a fan, I wanted the show to be good, and it just breaks my heart to say that it's the biggest disappointment of the year for me, and it's not even close. I literally feel just the way I felt after watching episode 9 of Star Wars. Like all of the stuff that I love was just crushed in a grinder and then left to dust. And after the first season, the show had promise, but now it seems that it's just going in the completely opposite direction. It should be. Instead of drawing as much as possible from the beloved existing source material, it disregards what was there and instead tries to invent new things on its own. And they all suck dick, much like the entire show does. Worst of all, right now I cannot see a way it can actually fix itself, it can correct its course, because to me it is just no longer The Witcher in anything but name. In nature, in spirit, in execution, it's nothing more than a bunch of poorly written fanfiction which uses the name of a beloved property to find its audience. Shameful is what it is.